1,000 words had come much easier than Vlad had expected. He read the paper over again and resisted the urge to erase nearly every word. After scarfing several handfuls of potato chips and drinking a blood bag, Vlad flopped down on the couch and immersed himself in the world of Count Orlok, the creature known in the cinematic world simply as Nosferatu. The movie had just reached the part where Count Orlok is traveling by raft when Vlad's mind began to wander down whatever road had taken Mr. Craig from Bathory Junior High. Rumors at school had echoed the suspicions of both the police and the media. Someone was responsible for the disappearance of the well-liked 8th grade teacher, and no one knew whom to blame. People were saying that nothing seemed to be amiss. Mr. Craig's car still sat in his driveway. His belongings remained in their usual arrangement. His bank account hadn't been touched. If Mr. Craig had vanished of his own accord, he'd left with nothing but the clothes he wore, and that wouldn't have gotten him very far from the small suburban town of Bathory. Foregoing the rest of the film, Vlad clicked off the television and tiptoed upstairs. Amenti, Nellie's fluffy, plump black cat, rubbed against Vlad's legs. Vlad stroked her soft fur, and she arched her back in response. Nellie had named Amenti after the Egyptian goddess who was said to have guarded the gateway to the afterlife. The goddess, much like the cat, had beautiful hair and practically lived in trees. It was a fitting name, as Vlad had come home on a number of occasions to find Amenti's pudgy body wedged in the lowest crook of the old oak tree in the backyard, though he was confounded to explain just how she had managed to waddle her way up there. After a brief interval in his bedroom to retrieve his jacket and one of the many photo albums he'd found in the attic, Vlad grabbed several candles from the drawer in the library and stuffed them into his coat pocket. Amenti nudged his ankle with her forehead, demanding his attention once again. Vlad reached down and scratched behind her ears. She purred happily and slinked away. He moved down the stairs, careful not to make a sound, and slipped out the front door into the brisk night. The streets were empty and dark. Vlad avoided the sidewalks, choosing instead the small beaten paths that wove between this house and that, the mark of many kids before him who'd been in search of the quickest route between school and home. Vlad rounded each corner with a careful step and threw a glance in each direction. He hadn't yet been caught out after curfew, but there was always a chance that he might be. He reached the side of Bathory High and paused briefly when he heard laughter. It was likely just the goth kids who often occupied the high school's steps after dark. Vlad slipped around to the back of the school. Bathory High School had been built up in the hollowed-out remains of a very large, very old Catholic church. It was well known that the church had been deserted sometime in the mid-1800s as a result of some sort of horrific affair, but locals had protested tearing the historical building down. Then, nearly 100 years later, a wealthy businessman had purchased the property and developed it into what had been known as Bathory Preparatory Academy. 20 years later, the school became a public institution. It was probably the most interesting thing about Bathory. When Vlad reached the back of the school, he looked around to be certain he was alone, then closed his eyes and willed his body upward. His feet left the ground, and he floated up to the school's belfry. The bell tower was large and square. Several arching windows lined its walls, open to the elements at all times. Vlad walked along the ledge and looked down on the group of teenagers on the front steps. They wore black from head to toe, merely shadows amid more shadows. Vlad smiled. He slipped inside one of the windows and dug the candles from his pockets. Small mounds of wax dotted the room, remnants from previous visits. Vlad placed the new candles on the floor and lit their wicks with a lighter he kept on one of the windowsills, illuminating the room with a soft glow. The bells had long been removed from the tower, and the only door had been sealed shut when the building became a school. The only way in or out was through the windows, and the ground was 4 stories below them. The room was large and empty but for several books that had been banned from both the school and the town's library, and a framed photograph that had been propped against a stack of stray red bricks at the center of the room. Vlad knelt and moved the candle closer to the picture. "Hi, Dad." Thomas Todd smiled back, a portrait of happiness forever fixed. Vlad looked around his sacred space and sighed. "I should get a chair." He placed the photo album on the floor near the candle. The cover was green leather. On the front was a family crest. Vlad flipped to the first page and smiled at the photograph of his mother, Melina. She was standing near an old car, looking young and pretty. Her eyes twinkled. On the hood of the car sat a younger version of Nellie, wearing a bright, happy grin. Vlad turned the page. He saw pictures of his parents' wedding, of their popular Halloween parties, of their lips locked in happy, wedded bliss. He ran his hand across one photograph of Thomas crouching in front of Melina's swollen, pregnant belly. His hands cupped her tummy. Vlad's smile faltered some, and he closed the album. This was all he had left of his family. Pictures and memories. He lay back on the dusty floor. Moonlight shone through the windows, painting the darkest areas of the room in pale blue. The candle's flame flickered, and just as the first tear squeezed from Vlad's eye, the light went out. Vlad lay in the darkness and released his pain the only way he knew how. He cried. At some point he must have fallen asleep. Vlad rubbed his eyes. He stood and slipped out onto the ledge, leaving the photo album behind with the rest of his treasures. The town was still very dark. Vlad looked down, hoping to catch another glimpse of his fellow nightwalkers, but the goth teens had gone. He was alone. As he floated down to the ground, Vlad looked back up at the belfry. It was the highest point of Bathory, and each time Vlad went there, he was the closest he'd ever been to leaving the small town behind. He darted between the houses and paused once his front door was in sight. Mr. Craig's house was only 2 streets over, directly behind Henry's. He slipped between the houses and smiled at the sight of Mr. Craig's tiny bungalow. The porch glowed dimly from the streetlight on the corner, a welcoming hue of white on the stark black of night. He stepped onto the porch and rang the bell. As childish as he knew it was, he was half hoping, half expecting Mr. Craig to open the door and lecture him on why it was rude to visit someone's home in the middle of the night. But no one answered. The screen door screeched as he pulled it open. He knocked loudly on the inner door, then stopped as it opened inward. Vlad looked over his shoulder at the quiet street. He stepped inside and closed the door behind him. The police had been here a zillion times, so Henry had said, but they might have missed something. They had to have missed something, or Mr. Craig would have been found by now. And why was the door left unlocked? Bathory cops were bumbling idiots, sure, but didn't they know how to lock up a possible crime scene? Beside the door sat a dark mahogany hat tree, adorned with Mr. Craig's jacket and scarf. An umbrella was looped over one of the pegs. Vlad moved through the hall with slow, sure steps. The house smelled like dust, as if no one had been here to fill the air with the scent of pine cleaners and bleach in a long time. He half expected to see cobwebs, but he was sure the scent was a trick of his wild imagination. Vlad's shoes moved soundlessly over the bare wood floors as he approached the kitchen at the end of the hall. A closet door stood open, blocking his path, so he closed it. A painting hung on the wall opposite him of a red-haired woman holding a sword in front of her chest. Her eyes were closed, as if she were sleeping, which made no sense, what with the raging fires painted around her. He wondered if it was a painting of Joan of Arc, the famous French heroine Mr. Craig had told him about at the beginning of the school year. Up ahead, something moved. Vlad didn't know what, or who it was, but something had crossed the open door at the end of the hall. It may have been black, but he couldn't be sure, as there was only a little light illuminating his view. Swallowing his fear, Vlad took a step toward the door, where the thing had been. "Hello?" A rustling sound answered him, followed by gunshots. Bang! Bang! Vlad ducked, covering his head with his arms as if flesh alone could protect against bullets. Bang! Bang! Risking a shot to the head, Vlad lowered his arms and tried to get a clear view of his assailant. No one stood at the end of the hall, and a glance over his shoulder showed the similar lack of anyone by the front door, armed or otherwise. Bang! Bang! Vlad rolled his eyes and stood. He moved into the kitchen and pulled the back screen door closed. The banging ceased. Some hero he was. After an extensive search of the living room, dining room, and kitchen, Vlad decided to continue his search upstairs. So far, nothing seemed amiss at all, but Vlad couldn't bring himself to believe Mr. Craig would just vanish without a word to him. They'd been more than student and teacher, they were friends.